start. And I think you're doing a pretty good job, Scott and Deb. And so I think there's just a nice opportunity for us here today just to kind of ask you a couple of questions around the work you've been doing and also what you're planning to do into the future. To share with you a little bit around the work we're doing in South Africa and Africa. Just like compare notes a little bit around the work we do on credentials in these two parts of the world. So on the call, I've got a group of people. I'm quickly going to just give you a sense who we've got. We've got colleagues of mine at JET, a non-profit, that work closely with me, some more technical, others more kind of in a research space. We've got a colleague or two from the University of Cape Town that is helping us with developing a taxonomy similar to the CTDL. Or maybe I mustn't say similar because I'm going to get into trouble. Maybe we need to talk about, is it similar? So that's Francois, that's on the call. We also have some colleagues that are part of our advisory group. As I mentioned earlier, we call it a launch group. And so there are a couple of colleagues, and maybe just now, if we're not a too big group, I'm happy for them to unmute and talk to you and tell you what their day jobs are. But that's kind of a broad range of the people on the call. And so I'm going to jump right into it and introduce the two of you and then jump off with a question. Are you good, Scott, on your side?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay, Deb, all good?
Yep, all set.
Okay, so let's jump in, guys. And those that join us late will find us on the way. So just quick bios. We did put it on the advert. So Scott is the CEO of the Credential Engine. Scott has 25 years of experience in this kind of area. Now, Scott, you're like me, I'm getting a bit worried. I see a bit less hair than me, but my hair's all white. So when you say you've got 25 years of experience, it's starting to get quite serious. But I think it's nice, and thank you so much for also giving us some of your time, Scott, as CEO. I'm sure you're busy around these kind of things. So thank you for joining us and for being part of this session today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Scott is joined by Deb Everhart. As we started the call, I mentioned Deb's reputation precedes her in a good way. And so Deb is doing excellent work, and Deb is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Credential Engine. And Deb's bio was shared with you, so I'm not going to read it, but maybe what I can do briefly for both of you, just like a quick intro, guys, what your day job is at the Credential Engine, and maybe can I jump right in with a question? What keeps you awake at night? So can we go for it? If you want to go, Scott.
Yeah, thank you. And good morning, good afternoon again to all of you. Thank you for the honor of your joining this conversation today. So first, let me just do a quick explanation of what Credential Engine is, because that will help explain what keeps me awake at night. So Credential Engine, like yourself, is a nonprofit organization. We have been around for officially about 6 years. There was a research endeavor that preceded that. But Credential Engine's mission is really quite simple. We work every day to bring what we refer to as credential transparency to the entire ecosystem, the marketplace of credentials and the providers of those credentials and the owners of those credentials, and essential information about the skills that are included in them, the quality of them, the outcomes, the pathways, the assessments, the learning opportunities. Anything that a learner or a student, a worker, an employer would need to know in order to be able to make their most informed decision. And critically, to have that information be accessible as open data on the modern web. So we are working in an ecosystem right now in the United States where there's about 1 million unique credentials. So what keeps me up at night is how do we speed up our efforts to have really full adoption across the entire United States and indeed around the world of open data technologies so that we can better serve everybody who's trying to figure out how to best advance themselves and have family sustaining wages in their economy.
Okay, I think that's pretty comprehensive and nice and succinct. Thanks for that, Scott. Okay, Deb, how about you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Everhart. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Credential Engine. And I come to this work from a long background in learner-centric strategies, in portfolios, and working in the open badges movement since the very beginning. And that's involved a career in ed tech and product strategy and architecture. But the work at Credential Engine is so incredibly mission driven that, it keeps me up it keeps me up at night because it's so exciting and there's so many opportunities. The other way of thinking about what keeps you up at night is not just what you're excited about, though, but what you're concerned about. And I think we are at a critical nexus in terms of connecting learning ecosystems and very explicitly data systems and employment and work-based systems, including in the informal economy and serving people who have less access to more sophisticated systems, or are perhaps, have less control over what systems that they can access. So what keeps me up at night in terms of concern is making this transition to the credential transparency and the skills-based ecosystems that Scott described in a way that is equitable, fair, as rapid as possible, opening up as much opportunity as possible, and not just a land grab by big providers.
Okay, so that's a nice start, guys. So colleagues, those of you that are on the call, if you can use the chat for questions for now, we'll go for about 10-15 minutes and then take a break for questions. And we're not a huge group, so we will definitely give you a chance. So just give us a while just to get going. So my kind of first question I have will be top of mind for both of you, and feel free to respond as you want. It's actually not on the list of questions I sent you, so please just, if you feel like I'm surprising you, just tell me. But the question I always have is, what is the difference between a credential and a qualification? Is it the same thing, in the space that you operate in? Because in our space, people get so confused with these two terms. Who wants to have a bite at it?
Well, qualifications are typically, is a phrase that's typically used to describe formal credentials. So let me describe what I mean by formal credentials. So maybe that's best placed by saying how broad our definition of credentials is. So if you think about the whole landscape of education and training and career credentials that are occupational licenses and certifications, then you look at degrees, certificates, badges, micro-credentials. That's what we mean when we say credentials. That nests within the broader category of credentials in terms of like what the World Wide Web Consortium Verifiable Credentials work group means, when they also include VCs, verifiable credentials, include identity credentials, work history, things like work visas, right? So in our work, we focus on education and training credentials broadly, which includes formal qualifications. We do not do work that involves identity credentials. In fact, we don't do anything with personally identifiable information.
Okay, that's pretty good, Deb. It's pretty much aligned with our thinking. I often use the term that it's kind of a CV on steroids. It's all the knowledge, skills, and competencies that one captures, whether it's professional or formal. And I like your link to qualifications and formal. But there's so much stuff happening in short courses and just-in-time learning. Hey, and so are you guys in the Credential Engine able to bring all of those experiences, knowledge, skills, and competencies into a single credential? Is that what you do?
That's actually a really good way to describe it. So back to your last question, the term credential or qualification or degree or alternative credential is just, they're so randomly used and they get really confusing to people. So when we talk about this ecosystem, ideally what we'll be able to describe is in one set of descriptive languages, the owner of a credential or qualification, the provider of that credential, the skills and competencies that reside in that credential, whether that be delivered by a university, an industry certification body, a state licensing body, a secondary school, an online provider like Southern New Hampshire University or IBM or Aon, anyone who is providing any set of skills packaged into a credential intended to help advance somebody's qualifications, their capabilities for a position. So the million credentials that we count include work-based learning. They include micro badges and micro credentials, and really down to the very granular level of what could be considered a credential. And honestly, as we move, at least in the United States, into what I'm honestly surprised is a faster transition than I expected to a skills-based hiring and development economy, where we have less focus on did you earn a degree versus what are the skills you have. Being able to describe all of that in a common language is going to be essential in order to help people convey what they know and what they can do and what they have done in learning records or pathways or CVs on steroids or whatever the format is.
It's so nice to talk to people that are talking the same language. We often, in this space, there's not a lot of countries that are really grappling with this in a serious way. And you guys have been leading some of this thinking. In our context, as Southern Hemisphere country and working in Africa, a lot of countries are grappling with basics, just proper record keeping, no matters, more sophisticated modes of record keeping. So maybe linked to this would be my next question. I don't know, Deb, if you're welcome to take it. It's the idea of data privacy. So, data privacy is a big thing that gets exploited, particularly in developing countries. So what are you guys doing around data privacy as Credential Engine?
Well, explicitly nothing. Because we don't do any work that involves any personally identifiable information. Now, but I say that it's obviously a very serious topic, and we follow it because in our work in helping guide states and institutions and other organizations and how to develop learning and employment records, we absolutely refer to this as a high priority. However, we do not have the expertise and we do not lead the actual work to protect privacy.
Okay, I think that's a fair answer. Do you want to add, Scott?
Scott has something to add.
Well, I was going to extend on that and say, because our mission around the ecosystem of what is offered is focused on all of this information should be accessible as linked, open, interoperable, transparent data. We, when we work with someone who says, how do I have all of this information about what's provided inside of my own system? Our answer is we don't want that information just held inside your own system. We want the information about what's offered and the skills that they have and the quality and the outcomes and the links to job requirements. That should all be open public data. Now, what is it that Scott has earned should be private. I should be able to control that. But what I've earned, the generic description of the thing should be open data, because an employer wants to know what that is, and the public wants to know, and a policymaker wants to know, is that credential containing the skills needed to meet the economic requirements of my country, of my region, of my city, of my employers? So there's a difference between what is it that Scott has versus the thing that Scott has.
I'm with you. I think it's clear, and we mustn't forget that your US context is quite different to ours. There are similarities, of course, but there are also differences. And so the one key difference that I want to just probe a little bit, in the work we're doing in South Africa, we're very closely aligned to government. So our system, our work around interoperability, around credentials is about really helping the government systems to interrelate and to interoperate, so that is our primary focus. Help us a little bit to understand how you guys work with, I know, federal system, states and all this kind of stuff. Just help us a little bit to understand how Credential Engine positions itself in the US.
I'll start with that and then let Deb take it, because there's a few different ways to answer that. So I think the best analogy to how you describe the relationship with government is when we're doing work with the individual states. And let me take the state of Texas, our probably one of our largest states here. They very much came to us and said, all of our government agencies, whether it's looking at the K-12 system, the workforce and further education system, or the formal higher ed system, they don't know how to talk to each other. because they have information about what's offered under their funding streams or under their governance structures that are in separate systems. And yet we know that the same credential might be provided to a high school student, a dislocated and unemployed worker, or a college enrollee. And so what they've asked us to do is to use our common data infrastructure in order to give the state government a better picture of what's happening in the state and where they can make improvements to have more streamlined pathways to employment. Now, at the federal level, you're right. Our federal government is very much a arm's length from all of this. And anytime you talk about helping the federal government get better access to data, you get into all sorts of political landmines. But if you think about it at the local, at the state level, I think there is quite a bit of alignment with how we work with governments in order to help them. But we also do a lot of work with the vendor community and the provider community. And let me just let Deb talk a little bit about that, because they are a very important constituency here.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'll double back on a couple of points that Scott brought up. One, we do absolutely work with federal agencies and other bodies in the federal government. For example, the U.S. Department of Labor makes the entire ONET occupational framework and industry frameworks available as CTDL. They make it available on their website as CTDL. You can go get it just the same way we do. And so there's good progress in our work with federal agencies. I was at a convening a couple of years ago, and the groups were trying to figure out how to get a good handle on the learn and work ecosystem. And some said, oh, it has to be federal top down, because otherwise it'll never be uniform. And others are like, what about state control, blah, blah. And I said, well, it needs to be states. And someone said, well, why? There are 50 of them. That's a lot of work. And the response is that in the US, the states are closer to the needs of the people. Sure. That the states make decisions that are more regional, more applicable to what their priorities are. And there's a lot of collaboration among the states. And so a good example of that is that the National Governors Association has a skill-driven state cohort that they've been working with over last year and into this year, that is doing a lot of work with LERs at the state level, and then being able to optimize that for the systems and the needs in the state, but then also coordinate that across states, and importantly, leverage vendor relationships. So the vendor relationships in a state, how do they apply to LERs and getting the right data and the right systems for people? And how do multiple states that have contracts with these vendors help move the market in terms of saying, this is what we need? And I'm kind of focusing on LERs, but it really is about data transparency in general.
I get it. Look, it's about a common language, eh? Yep. So just two acronyms you use, Deb. So LER, Learner Employment Record. Just for not everybody might be familiar. And then just quickly, I don't know, one of you just tell us, not everybody's familiar with ONET, the US occupational taxonomy. Could you just give us a quick, few lines on it? What is ONET? Just either of you.
Yeah, Deb, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So the ONET is the occupational framework of the US, from the US Department of Labor. And it not only has the structure of all of the occupation skills, the specific physical capabilities and tasks that are associated with those occupations, and also the relationships among the different occupations and the common names in terms of job titles for those occupations out in the world. And then within that, there are specific industry frameworks. They're shaped like a pyramid. So they have the broadest set of necessary skills at the bottom, and they work up to more specialized skills at the top of the pyramid. And then there are other US government agencies that have developed specific taxonomies like NICE, which is the US cybersecurity framework. And those are all loosely coordinated. Well, everything in the Department of Labor is coordinated. NICE is loosely coordinated. But all of that data is in the credential transparency description language so that it can be connected to credentials and skills and jobs and other data that's in the credential transparency description language.
Okay, so let's slow it down and get people with us now. So the CTDL is the third acronym I think let's introduce. So it was LER and ONET. ONET is spelled O*net if people want to Google it. And then the CTDL. So CTDL, we're getting a bit more technical now, but this is now the important thing. I think this is the oil that makes Credential Engine work. So
DNA.
Tell us a little bit more and maybe start from basics and then let's see how far you want to push. I don't know, who wants to go? Scott, do you want to have a go?
I'll start with the basics because I tell everybody I am not a technology expert. I do policy and I run the organization, but I leave it to Deb and our technology team to dive into the details. So let's go back to the I'll give an analogy here. We're living in a country that has 1 million credentials, and it's offered by 60,000 plus different providers. So it's an incredibly complex marketplace. And if you want to help a student or a learner be able to understand and compare and analyze and make decisions about how do I piece together some of these credentials into a meaningful pathway, you need to be able to have all of the information about all of those credentials and what they offer accessible, not in Spanish for one, English for another, Chinese for a third. And we need to have a common tabula rasa that allows us to have common understanding across them all, and allow them all to still maintain any particular unique language for themselves as they want, because that's the way that these things work. So there were a group of individuals who looked around the world and said, well, we can provide common information on the web for your travel experience. And you can look up any hotel in the world and be able to find information about a hotel. Or you can look for a new car and be able to compare cars. And we should be able to compare and have common information about providers of credentials and the credentials themselves and the skills on the modern open web. And there are frameworks to do this. We just need to dig in and create a very specific one for this space. So a group of people came together and looked at what has been done on the World Wide Web Consortium, which is where we actually have written up the rules for how the web works, and schema.org, and said we can take those frameworks and we can create a very specific set of descriptive languages for education and training. And that is the Credential Transparency description language in the simplest. So we're providing a way to have open information shared about credentials and providers and everything else on the modern web. And from there, I'm going to let Deb take it to a little bit more of a detailed description.
Okay, before Deb goes, just hold Deb for a second. So Scott, just to be clear, so effectively you've created a language that both supply and demand side can understand.
Yes.
Because that's really the key, isn't it? Often educationalists have all sorts of learning outcomes and taxonomies and stuff, and then the workplace has got different taxonomies. Is CTDL in between those? Or
Yes.
Not really? Okay, go for it, Deb.
Yeah, so, but also let me clarify something you just said about taxonomies. And as I understand it from your work and the taxonomies that you're developing, if you think about a taxonomy as being a structure, a framework, and then say, for example, the competency frameworks or the definitions of occupations say the competency statements and the definitions of occupations that are within that framework, we're the framework. Okay, so we don't write skill statements. We don't define occupations. What we do is we provide the common open data structure for all of these different communities of practice to come together and basically fill the framework with content, if that analogy makes sense. So I think it's good to make sure we're on the same page about that. Does that make sense, James?
No, it's important, Deb, and I think as we talk, we've got to try and better understand what you do, and of course the audience as well. If you're providing a common open data structure, it means that you're using the other structures to complement your work, like ONET and so on. So you're not trying to duplicate. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. That's right.
That's right. And to go into it in a little more detail, Scott mentioned that this is based on W3C specifications, and it's CTDL is actually a set of schemas. So there's a schema that is the main schema that includes credentials, pathways, courses, assessments, quality assurance structures, information about the organizations that offer those. And then there's CTDL ASN, which is explicitly about competencies, but it's fully nested and interwoven with the rest of the CTDL. And then there's Q data, which is quantitative data, which is a set of specialized structures for defining things that are quantities, like employment outcomes for credentials. So it's a set. They all fit together. They all harmonize not only with schema.org and other global infrastructure that is not about credentials, but also with any other taxonomy or data structure that that covers this same arena. We do a lot of work with mapping so that different schemas can connect to each other. Okay, so just one or two more questions, and I'm going to open to the audience. But Scott, do you want to go first?
Well, I think it's also important to realize that CTDL and the family of the CTDL schema are not finished products. They are evolving living languages that we spend a lot of time sitting with our university partners or our industry certification partners or states and governments who tell us what you have is really good, but we need a term to describe this that fits our context. And that context could be the US Navy, who we work very closely with, says that we need to describe certain things about sailors that is not relevant if you're working in other settings. We're having lots of conversations with other countries, from Australia, New Zealand, to the Middle East, to Canada, and learning from them if we were to use CTDL, because it is designed to be available on the open web anywhere in the world, we would need terms that fit our context. Great, let's put together a task group and bring experts together and help define the new terms that need to be used. And the thing that we focus most on is making sure that those terms that get added to CTDL are added in a way that doesn't break the rest of the CTDL system and the people who are already using it. So we have to just make sure that it fits in seamlessly. But the intention is to keep this growing, because the marketplace of credentials and employer requirements is always going to be growing and changing. And that's a good thing. We just need to make sure the CTDL stays up to speed with the needs of the users.
Okay, a couple of years ago, I worked with a colleague at Commonwealth of Learning, and we spoke about the concept of a wiki standard. And the idea is building on the Wikipedia idea that standards or schemas can evolve through collaborative, and that's kind of what I'm hearing from you guys as well. I've got many questions, but now I'm going to abuse my chairpersonship, so I'm going to pause for a second. So Simpiwe, help me. Colleagues, if you have a question, raise your hand, and Simpiwe will just spotlight you if you don't mind. It'll be nice to see you. And if you're really in your PJs or something and you don't want to be spotlighted or whatever, just tell us. But it'll be really nice to get a couple of key questions just for us to engage with, so it's not only me asking the questions. Can I get any volunteers to start us off with? And simply, just help me, please.
Sure. I think Darren has put something on the chat. I think he might want to expand on that, if you don't mind. And then in terms of spotlighting, it seems like only, let's see. Okay. Okay, Darren, you can go in the meantime.
Okay, so it's incredibly mind-blowing, Scott and Deb. Thank you. I just want to check my understanding or my emerging understanding, if I could say that. So in the the ONet that you're talking about, my understanding is it's linked to what we call an occupational framework. It's an OFO code, South African, and the way you've explained it, could that in and of itself be a credential within and of itself? So a simple example would be in South Africa, we'd have one of our OFO codes would probably be a procurement manager, and that would be registered with our Department of Higher Education. Could that be a credential that I could own, if that makes sense? I don't even know if my question makes sense.
Okay, so an occupational title more, Darren, is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah. So could that in and of itself be a credential? So BP could go, oh, we're looking for a procurement manager versus we're looking for someone with a whole bunch of credentials that we don't know how to define.
Okay, let's have a go. Who wants to go? Deb, you look like you want to go first. Go for it.
Scott, did you want to go first?
Well, I was just going to give an example, a practical example here, Darren. In most of the U.S. context, it being a procurement manager would probably not be considered a credential in the way that you're talking about. It's not an education credential. It would be an indicator of an occupational title that you've held. But interestingly, our work with the U.S. Navy, if you reach Master Chief second stage, that is considered a credential in the Navy, because they just take for an assumption that you've done everything necessary to have earned the skills and competencies to be awarded the Chief of Master Chief second class. And so they consider that a credential. It's not as common a concept formally in the rest of the civilian economy in the US, but given that it works that way in the Navy and we've modeled it that way, if any other country or any other industry considers the occupational title to be a credential, there's nothing about CTDL that would not be able to support that.
It's a nice example. It kind of links to designations, doesn't it? You know, in some professions, a designation would also be a credential.
Certainly could be.
Okay.
Okay,
thanks. Deb, do you want to add?
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to tease out a little bit the relationship between a credential as defined in the Credential Transparency description language and a credential as issued to an individual person. Because first of those are obviously different things. We do not do the latter. We do not issue credentials, but you could have, for example, you could use an occupational framework and a skills taxonomy and maybe even, required certifications might all be part of the data description of that procurement officer, right? But then when that person gets issued credentials, they might have a credential for their industry certification, a credential for their work history, credentials for specific skills that are part of that job. And then they might also have a credential that says procurement officer, and it may or may not include all of those things. But part of the value of the CTDL data structure is that you can put it inside any and all of those credentials so that they are interoperable in terms of the meaning of what's inside.
I think that's helpful. Thanks. Darren is on our launch group, just for Scott and Deb to understand. So he's part of our advisory group. And he talks a lot about NFTs, if we give him a chance, non-fungible tokens, but not today, Darren, not today. Okay, Simpiwe, can you bring Roxana in, please? Roxana, do you want to go?
Before she goes, I'd also like to abuse my power because there's two gentlemen that have posed their questions, but then Joanne. So two gentlemen, one lady. So we'll start with the lady. Joanne, if you don't mind coming in, and we'll spotlight you with your PJs.
Oh, it's okay. It's dark here, so I'm on my phone. Thank you for that. The question I have is, and you've kind of starting to get to that with some of your comments just made. In my experience, there's a lot of need to first do a lot of pre-work. What is that content? What are those learning outcomes, et cetera, and then to put it in, excuse me, in a machine readable format. Is there any advice you can give the communities that to help move in that direction so that you can then ladder into the kind of supports that your organization is providing?
Okay, so just quick intro. Joanne is part of the Groningen Declaration Network. She's actually the chairperson or director, Joanne? Director?
Executive director.
Executive director, okay. And she's also part of our advisory team, just for context. Okay, anybody want to take first stab at answering?
Well, I would say the simple answer is put that learning outcome and course information in CTDL because then it's machine actionable. And, you know, there is a great deal of hand-wringing about the fact that educational competency statements are generally written differently than occupational skill statements, and oh no, how are we all going to, air quotes, speak the same language? Well, you know, fortunately, there's a lot of machine learning and AI now that can be applied to this information. But if it's information that's like out there in PDFs and Word documents and whatever, it's much, much harder for AI to make effective use of it. So if everyone involved in these ecosystems takes all the information they have and they put it in CTDL, then it's structured data, much, much easier to parse and use effectively as machine actionable data, even across ecosystems. That may be an overly simplistic or an overly technical answer. So let me know if you're looking for something different.
You know, I think Joanne's clapping, so she's broadly happy. You know, for me, I'm hearing translation device. Deb, is that the wrong word to use? Is CTDL a translation tool or not?
It's a framing tool, right? So, for example, if you get a body of raw information, as is what's usually on web pages, right? It's usually not structured, for example. What is a translation system going to do with it? It's going to have a much harder time than if that translation system knows this is a learning outcome, this is a course title, this is a job description, right? Then it's going to be able to parse these things much more effectively.
Okay, so maybe a parsing tool is a better. Joanne, you want to quickly follow up, then I'm going to bring Roxana in, but if you want to go quickly, Joanne.
Yes, I'm just having trouble. Just one sec. Yes, I'm just having trouble with the systems here. What I was going to ask you is, using either the example you used before or perhaps another example, do you have any information or past practice that has lent the answer to this question? How long has it been taken in your experience for a community or an organization to do what it is you're proposing? Can you give an example? Is it a multi-year kind of initiative? Have you found a particular exemplar that's done this quickly?
Okay. Scott, can you talk about some of our experience in states?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I need to say is that we're talking about the United States here primarily, and the United States has not been very good at all about having good data management systems across its education and occupational credentialing space. So I would answer that by saying some of the newer organizations and the newer institutions that have come into existence in the United States in the recent past have come in with very thoughtful data management structures and approaches to data, and they've been able to publish all of their information and think about how to use it better very, very quickly. There are other states and systems and institutions that are quite old and have legacy data systems that do not do a very good job of talking to each other in the first place. And like I said, the reason Texas invited us in is that Texas is living with multiple data systems and data structures, and they want to be able to help vendors, whether it's a learning and employment record vendor, a pathway vendor, a tool for use with counseling high school students. they need better information, and the traditional vendors that they were talking to were just focused on delivering a different version of the same product. And what we're able to do is to sit with Texas. And so to answer your question, we've been working with Texas now for about a year, and there will be several tens of thousands of records published about the credentials and the providers. But it's taken us about a year to help them be able to ask the questions necessary to even understand where their data are not in good shape. And as they move to making all of this data transparent, they want to make sure that they're putting out correct information with the right assessments of outcomes and quality. But once they've done it, and they've done it once, and they've aligned it to CTDL, it's easy to keep it up to date. And so this is a bit of a lift for the state of Texas, but the benefits will be enduring for quite some time.
Okay, I think it's a nice example. Simply, can you bring Roxana in? Roxana, over to you. Roxana is the overall program manager on the Pset Cloud, just by way of introduction. So that's what she does, half of a day job. The other half, I'm not allowed to give her more work to do. Okay, Roxana.
Okay, thanks, James. And good to see you again, Scott. We met recently through our interview on governance. And hi to Deb. So your system sounds very complex because of the number of states you have, and looking at that integration across that is sort of very far-reaching, but you've made strides. In South Africa, we've got the National Qualifications Framework. So that's the formalized formal learning. We haven't gone into the informal aspects of that, which is what we're looking at through the Pset Cloud, and reaching out to the lifelong learning aspects of that. We also have on the organized framework, so we have for occupations, which is industry-based, and that brings in all your employers into that to designate their employees and their occupations. So we're sitting with very well-established and structured frameworks. We're currently looking at how is the best way to bring them both together. So, and of course, it's a national system. We have 9 provinces, and they're all governed by the same national system. So we don't have that complexity that you have with the federal states. So that's the one piece of advice that we would like. And also, I think, as a starting point, would it need an engine like yourself where you put them together and let it do its language processing and all of that? And the second part of my question linked to that is the standard setting process is lengthy. We've gone down this road for 20 years developing the National Qualifications Framework. It's expensive. To bring industry into those occupations takes a lot of stakeholder engagement. And so I'm not sure how lengthy and expensive your processes are in looking at the commonalities and buy-in by industry of the skills development processes that we've established. Thanks, James.
Thanks for 2 very simple questions and short questions. The opposite, Roxana. Okay, so let's have a quick go. Do you guys want to respond?
Well, first of all, the intention of CTDL is not necessarily to displace frameworks and data structures that you already have. It's important to keep in mind that what we would talk about in a situation like this is mapping. And one of the reasons that let's say 2 basic reasons that mapping can be important. One is you could use CTDL to bridge between your own data systems, for example, if you haven't already done that. And we all live in a global economy now. So when your data structures are mapped to CTDL and can be made available as linked open data, then they're going to be able to be interconnected with all of the data structures in the world that are using CTDL, while still preserving as needed the structures that you already have.
I would add.
Sorry, Scott, just quickly before we go. So, maybe it's not a fair concern there, but it's an important point for us. Is the idea that you envision CTDL to become, hegemonic is the word that comes to mind. It's not a nice word, but it's like dominant. Is that kind of what you aiming for? And I mean, I'm just asking the question very directly because it's important for us to have this conversation. Okay.
So the way I think about this, James, is that if we start with a belief that all of this information about credentials and skills and competencies and owners and providers and quality and pathways, all of this should be open linked data so that it can be used anytime, anywhere. It can help people who earn a credential. And the example I've been talking about quite a bit lately, going back to Afghanistan, as people were being displaced, they should be able to carry with them known records and verified records of what they've actually earned. That requires, in some degree, that we have this data as linked open data. There is right now, to our knowledge, and when we were created and started this work, there was no other open source, and I'll just repeat that. This is an open source. CTDL is not owned by Credential Engine. CTDL is an open source language. There was no other language in the world that worked on the modern web that allowed this to happen. And so the Lumina Foundation and JP Morgan Chase and a few others created this endeavor to create this language for the world's benefit. I have always said that if some other entity comes along that creates a different or better linked open data language that can be used on the open web by anyone, anytime, great. If that advances this mission and serves people better, and CTDL eventually becomes replaced by the next better language, that's wonderful because it will be serving our mission. It just won't serve it through CTDL. It'll serve it by getting better data into open systems for the benefit of people. So I would say that right now, because there is no other web-based system to do this, we would like CTDL to be used as broadly as possible for the value it was created to serve. But hegemony? No, I don't need that to be the case, because it's about the mission. It's not about the solution, and if we can come up with a better solution someday,
okay,
that's awesome.
Okay, now I had to ask it. I think it's something to talk about, and I think
it's a very important question. It's a very important question, especially, and I'm sensitive to this, coming out of the United States.
Yeah,
that there could be a perception that we have the answer and you should all listen to us. No, we've intentionally developed CTDL with international input as best we can, and we're continuing down that road.
Okay, I think that's fair. Are you covered, Roxana? Did he dodge your second question? Can I just check?
Yeah, I think just about the standards, because we're looking at that commonality, and usually with that goes that whole process of standards and acceptance
and the cost.
And the cost, and time, and the effort.
And just to, I think Deb mentioned this earlier, we don't want to restart or replace the wonderful work that's been done over 20 years to build those standards. What we're suggesting is that once those are done, those can be described using CTDL that allows a qualification standard that you have, your qualifications framework, to talk to other qualifications frameworks, and using CTDL as that connecting tissue, that connecting DNA. We've been working with a very early effort here in the United States to develop a US qualifications framework, and they plan on publishing it into CTDL so that you can actually map credentials to it, and you can map all these different certifications and skill sets and occupational frameworks to the US qualifications framework. We've had conversations, and we actually presented to the African Continental Qualifications Framework body about could CTDL be a resource for connecting qualifications frameworks into that kind of more meta framework across the continent. And your decision, not ours, but we believe that CTDL could be a benefit to having that common language across all of that.
A couple of people on the call are involved in the ACQF, so I mean there would be a couple of people familiar with it, but maybe for those that are not, this is really a continental effort at linking qualifications frameworks across the African continent. Back to the US, Scott, so Lumina, of course, is driving not a qualifications framework, but a credential framework for the US. And I think it's important that the naming there in your case is quite different to ours. You know, it signals thinking about a credential broader than a qualification. Am I right? Is that the kind of language that Lumina is using? Yeah.
Yeah. So Lumina initially, for those of you who don't know, Lumina has helped to drive a conversation in the United States about how can we get 65% of adults in the United States to have a high quality credential by the year 2025. And they recognize that they can't just be focused on degrees or qualifications to meet that goal. And in fact, there are licenses and certifications and apprenticeships and other types of credentials that should be recognized as high quality and be counted in that endeavor. So that's really one of the things that led to our creation, is to help have a system that describes the entire ecosystem.
It's a kind of sweet spot that you guys are in, that we're exploring, but you're a couple of years ahead of us, and I think you've been doing good work. Can I open to somebody else? Flornie, did Flornie have a question? Maybe he wants to come in.
Yes, and then followed by Dinah.
Okay, thanks, Simpiwe. Flornie? If Flornie is not able to...
Unmute, Flornie.
Okay, guys, I'm not going to waste too much time. Let's go for Daniel.
No, Dinah.
Oh, Dinah. Dinah, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, James, and thank you for the information. It's very insightful. So I just want to know if you are able to track the number of people who are able to access the data. And if that's the case, how frequently do they do so, and at what intervals?
I think that's a useful question for clarifying one of the things that we do not do. So we do not build products. And we have data in the registry that's viewable via what we call the Credential Finder. And that tool is really a viewer and a way of exploring the data that's in the registry. But it's our intention is to support a marketplace of many different types of products that use CTDL. So the way people access the Finder is not really our mission. Having products using the data is our mission. That makes sense.
So we work with, for instance, the state of Texas will hire and contract with a set of providers who will use the data to provide learning and employment records or pathway tools, or other resources that would face students and workers and employers. So they would be the system that would be tracking user interface, and our data would be mixed in with lots of other data. The beauty about having linked open data is that we don't track where the actual job openings are, but other data systems do. And so these vendors would pull our data in with those data and other resources to serve students. So yeah, we don't have that level of information. We'd have to go get it from our partners in Texas and Florida and Indiana and New Jersey and elsewhere.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. And Deb, you're right. It's good to hear what you don't do. It helps us also to understand. So can I switch to a different topic? And the topic is governance. Mm-hmm. So we've been really kind of preoccupied with, while we've been busy with the Pset cloud, we've been really thinking about, so what will govern a system like this, and we're not coming from it, like, we know it can't be government on its own. And in our context, it can't be private sector on its own either. So we're trying to bring this ecosystem process together in a way that we're looking at new forms of governance. I see Chelsea is with us. I mean, Chelsea, I don't know, you've been doing a little bit of work in the legal space around this. Do you want to give them a quick sense of what we've done around an MOI, if you're okay to do that? I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot, and if you can say no if you want to. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, James. I do seldom give up an opportunity to talk. Lawyers do like to spend some airtime. So yes, we've been taking a look at the different legal, not necessarily the governance options just yet, but the interplay between legal entity and governance models. So the very first question that we as lawyers like to ask is, which home are we going to put this project into, which legal home? And we've been pushed to try and get a little bit creative with this. We're not just looking at the typical bog standard options that people want to throw it into. We need to see how far those legal entities can be pushed to accommodate this innovative space and new developments in the law like smart contracts and DAOs, and see how far we can push governance on a massive scale, and ownership, questions of who's going to own this, who's going to own the data, who's going to own the intellectual property attached, who's going to own the system, and who's going to take control over the decisions that are made in this entity. So that's the work that we've been doing in the background. At the moment, we've settled on one of the options that we're considering at this stage is a non-profit company under the South African Companies Act, which in my opinion is one of the most innovative pieces of legislation that's come out of South Africa in the last 10 years. It allows companies to make decisions electronically, to meet on large scales, and to bring in companies from very, very small scale, 3 people in a room wanting to change lives through soccer, to a massive company on this scale that gets hopefully the whole of South Africa involved on some level and taking an interest in their own personal data and their own personal impact. But all of those rules and all of those options need to be put into a legal document, and that's what we at NGO Law are drafting at the moment, with, of course, significant input from people who have ideas about how people should vote, which groups of people should be allowed to vote, how will they practically vote, and yeah, so that's our work with the MOI at the moment. I am open to questions if needed, but
okay, thanks. Thanks, Chelsea. You did use the opportunity very well that I gave you. I think the full acronym for today is a DAO. So a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization, and this is a governance mechanism that gets used somewhat across the world around voting systems and others. And we're starting to look, just like exploring at least the principles of a DAO within our governance. We're getting a bit of pushback from the lawyers, including Chelsea and her boss, that a DAO is not written into law in South Africa, so don't even try and go there. But can I come back to Credential Engine? How are you guys governed, and give us a sense how those structures work, if you don't mind?
Sure. So I think there's going to be an important distinction here between Credential Engine as a legal entity and the Credential Transparency description language. So Credential Engine is a nonprofit with a board of directors, no membership. We firmly believe that a membership structure for our purposes is a limiting and inequitable approach to managing the organization. The Credential Transparency description language, though, is a different, because it is an open source schema. So we do not own it, and we do not in the end have control over how it is developed. We have been shepherding the development of CTDL because there's been nobody else who really understands it well enough. But we suspect that over time that's going to change. And we suspect that over time that probably should change. And so, James, you raised the idea of a DAO in our conversation about the CTDL advisory group. And it's been on our mind that as CTDL is adopted and used more broadly around the world, it can't be back to just the simple shepherding of, myself and Deb and Jeannie and a handful of others. So the way that we have always worked is very open community. We have task groups, and we have a technical group that oversees the evolution of the CTDL, and to make sure that the formal structure remains intact and effective and doesn't break, because we do have states and the Navy who are dependent on it. So we have to make sure that it is functional. But the reality is that right now, if somebody in Costa Rica wants to create some CTDL terms and use it in their own context, they can, because it is an open source schema. And so we can't stop people but we can make sure that the version, the iteration of the schema that Credential Engine helps to manage is done in a way that is durable and follows policies and structures that people can see. So it's actually, James and Chelsea, something that we are aware of, we need to turn our attention to, which was part of the reason we wanted to start our own international advisory group, is to tell us what is the best model for the management of CTDL over time, in a broader context than just the United States. So I think we're wrestling with a little bit of the same question. The one thing I will say is that we are also very clear that we do not own the data. The data is owned by the institutions that are the owners or the providers of those credentials. So the easiest example is the University of Texas will put their data into CTDL and will make it accessible to the world as open data, but it's their data. They can remove it from CTDL if they want to. They're responsible for maintaining the information about its quality and connections and outcomes. Not outcomes, actually, that's done by the state. But it's not our data. We're here simply to make sure that it's accessible as open linkable data for the world to benefit from.
Okay.
So
just quickly on your University of Texas example, so the data is then anonymized and aggregated. So back to Deb's earlier point, there's no individual, you can't expose an individual on that data set, because we're quite nervous about this, that, data belongs to the citizen, to the individual, not to the entity. So when you talk about University of Texas data, it is the aggregated data.
well, it's the generic data about the degrees they offer, the skills that are included, the pathway connections, the course material, the assessments that are associated. When we come to aggregate information about outcome data, the average person who gets this degree gets $50,000 a year.
Sure.
That information would come in aggregate form, usually from the state of Texas, which does the analysis of the outcomes. But we do not then get any information about Deb, who actually earned that degree from the university. That is not in our systems at all. And we agree with you, that data should be owned by the individual. But Texas should be responsible for telling people what it is they actually taught in that degree program and what are the skills that were in the degree that Deb actually earned.
No, I think it's fair enough. We can probably talk about this for a while. Because we've got a chance now to take a second bite at this. We're trying to design a system that the individual always has control over the data, even to the end point where it gets utilized for aggregation, for analysis, and so on. The user still has that line, of control around how much data. And I mean, it's not easy. We're using self-sovereign identity for it. And I mean, we're at a point where this is probably the theory. We've developed the SSI protocol, but of course, we've still got a lot of work to be done around this. So it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure you're grappling with the same issues. Can I ask, we've got some of, Deb, do you want to go in quickly before I go?
Well, I just, since you brought up SSI, it brings to mind DIDs and unique identifiers. And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of DIDs, but I wanted to point out that part of the data structure of CTDL that we use in our credential registry is a CTID, which is a UUID. It's a globally unique identifier for each entity that's in the registry. Every credential, every skill, every course, every pathway, every organization. And so when you're doing that kind of longitudinal data, like you're talking about, so you're trying to trace, then that CTID can be very important, because you have a reliable way of going back to the data about that entity. It's not the PII, but provides that data thread, right?
Okay, no, fair enough. I can hear what your day job is, Deb. Okay, so we've got some quality council colleagues with us, and the quality councils are like the quality assurance bodies in South Africa that oversee our sectors, higher education, occupations, and schooling. So I'm going to put people a little bit on the spot. If they get cross with me, they can ignore me, but let's just have a quick go. Marco, anything from your side? Marco's from the Quality Council for Trades and Occupations. Just any comments or anything that kind of caught your ear, Marco, if you don't mind. And sorry for putting you on the spot.
That's okay, James. Yeah, I mean, I must say I'm very, very interested, particularly in CTDL. The entire system around it is something that certainly from the Quality Council that I work for, we've been striving to find this kind of common language that is both understandable by people who are looking for credentials, but also that is understandable by the workplace, and that it can kind of cross that divide between education and training for the workplace. I mean, I heard Darren's comment earlier also talking about, can you use kind of these derived titles like things that come from the OFO? Can you use them as credentials? And Deb's answer was pretty interesting, was that not exactly. But it's an avenue we've been exploring, and it's something in some of our qualifications that we've developed, they are a little bit close to the OFO. Those kind of descriptions more of workplace tasks, and they don't fit into this idea of what a credential is, with this wider applicability and the ability to move. So, I mean, certainly I've never heard of CTDL before today. I've checked it out on the website as we've been talking. So, I mean, I can see that this can actually be a really central thing for us, as quality councils, as people in the workplace. This can be something that we can latch onto that solves a lot of our problems around translation of credentials into qualifications. And I know that that's a big debate here. It's something that, because it's the first time I've seen it, all I can say is I find it very exciting and very interesting. And I really want to hear more, given this first experience. So I really appreciate the invite, James. And, certainly we've got to talk more about this, because it's something we've been looking for a while.
Thanks, Marco. I was in the UK a while ago when the Queen passed away, and I was at a Welsh conference, and the thought came to me to just use the following phrase, but it didn't go down so well. So let's just see how it goes. So now the phrase I use is the qualification is dead, long live the credential. So, they were saying the Queen is dead, long live the King. So, I think, there's something there that we need to really grapple with as countries and as a global community, really, not only as the US or South Africa. Can I ask TK, I think you knew I was going to put you on the spot. Are you anything from your side? Is this interesting to you, or any comments?
Hi, James. I have to apologize. Unfortunately, I joined the meeting 25 minutes later due to other meetings which overlapped. And I don't think my input will be well placed, but knowing very well that this is my area of interest when we talk credentials, I'm hoping that I'm going to get the recording and sort of like go through the whole presentation from start. My apologies on that one.
No problem. And thanks for being with us, TK. So I'm just going to put one more person on the spot, and then I'm going to ask Scott and Deborah if they have any questions. We're heading for the last 15 minutes or so of our session. Debbie, you work at one of our sector education and training authorities. Are you okay to just what is this doing for you? Are you interested? I mean, does this make sense? Are you okay to just respond quickly? And if you're not with, go, thanks.
Just a bit slow in the afternoon. Afternoon, everybody. James, I mean, absolutely, in part of the discussions and with great interest, representing the wholesale and retail sector, which is obviously a massive sector. In furthering discussions, I mean, I really do think that there's of great interest here, particularly as we take on new programmatic forms and new challenges around delivery. And particularly within the informal sector, which is predominantly where we want to focus. And this should be a really interesting aspect of how that potentially can work within that subsector of this, of the economy within the retail space. So yeah, with great interest.
Okay, maybe for Scott and Deb to get a sense, we're trying to do the ecosystem thing. So, we're really making our lives very difficult, because we're trying to get the whole ecosystem on the same page. And it's, of course, not straightforward. And so we've been at this for nearly 5 years. And we're starting to move towards some kind of concrete stuff now. So maybe the last person I want to put on the spot, I actually said last, but maybe the last. Motsamai, are you okay to come in? Motsamai has got a technical background and is working with us on our minimum viable product. And I just want to get a sense from Motsamai. Motsamai, what are you hearing? Anything that you would want to add?
Thank you for putting me on the spot, James. I think I just thought about this earlier, but I think my concern or question that I was actually curious about as far as the team is concerned is how have they actually took their different government entities in their confidence as far as data integration and interoperability is concerned, because I understand, like you just mentioned, within South Africa, a lot of government entities have a huge issue as far as exposing their data to external or proprietary platforms. So my query or my concern was, how have they made sure, or maybe the service providers that they integrate with, what have they done maybe to use as a value proposition in convincing the different entities that it's worthwhile providing this data for this type of work that they're working on?
The golden question. I'm also interested in the answer. Okay, guys, do you want to have a go, Scott?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think the first answer is, once we assure those government entities and the agencies and the institutions that we're not seeking any information about individuals, that the PII data is not included in this, that there's an enormous openness to saying, well, then what are you looking for? And when we talk about the information about the what is being offered, the credentials and qualifications, the skills that are included, the transfer values that you've assigned, things that they know that students want, they begin to understand the value, and they turn really then next to the question of, how do we manage pulling all that data together? But I want to take it to two other kind of theories that we've put into place here in the United States, which may or may not have value elsewhere. One is, we are working very hard at the state and the national level to have policy put in place that says that individuals, students and workers and employers should be able to have access to this information, because it does impact how they make more equitable, informed decisions about how they're going to spend their own and the public's money in order to get the education and training necessary to be contributing citizens in that country. So there is a policy rationale for having open data about this entire marketplace, not about, again, the individuals, but about the marketplace. The second is, we're working, as Deb has said, with more and more vendors and providers who actually build the tools that serve students. And as those vendors are able to put better products into place that are using open data, you're going to see more providers who say, we want our data in that format in CTDL, so it can be in more tools and products that are actually in front of students, because that's how students are going to find their way to our offering. So it's a mixture between, we don't touch PII, there is a public policy good here, and there is a market incentive as well. So we've been pushing all of those levers forward to, not every institution has said, we get it, we want to be there. This is a change management process, and we're working on that change. And the United States is a very large and complex, ecosystem. But we're learning a lot about how to actually help relieve people's concerns and show them the benefit as well.
It's very helpful. I mean, I'm reminded of the kind of field of dreams idea. Hey, build it and they will come. In the mix there. I mean, it's in the mix, but you're doing more than that.
Do I get to be Kevin Costner in that analogy?
I was told by software teams that, I use this metaphor, and they said, don't ever use it. And I said, but it makes sense to me, So I don't know. The techies don't always like that term, but it works for me at least. And it sounds like it works for you as well. Okay, can I pause a little bit and just Scott and Deb, anything you want to ask back to us? You don't have to, but I'm just giving you a chance.
Yeah, Deb, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to follow up on that prior point a little bit and repeat what we said before, is that we are a nonprofit and we're mission driven. Our name, sometimes people confuse us with a product company and they think that we are selling tech products. And so we always say when we start working with the tech vendors that we're vendor agnostic. And we want them to be able to get business value and make money off of, how they support the use cases. One simple example, there's a product that can take a link that's in a digital credential that connects to the registry and use that identifier to get more information from the registry to add to a person's skills profile and help that person do skills exploration. That's an important business proposition for that tech company. So that's what we want to foster, which is why we always emphasize that we're a nonprofit and we support it in the marketplace.
It kind of resonates well with our discussions. We're talking about like it's a plug and play idea that, what we've got is you can plug in your whatever you've got, whether it's non-profit, for-profit, or whatever else, but from our side now, we're trying to provide the common infrastructure. So we're not quite at the sophisticated level that you are, but the common infrastructure for the plug and play to be able to happen, not to duplicate vendor work, nor to duplicate what government agencies are doing. So that's kind of where we are.
Yep.
Two things, and I do have questions, but I also, if I can, in just the last 11 minutes here, two things that came up from two of the people you called on, and I think James this ties in nicely to that, the connectivity across the ecosystem. We have quality assurance organizations that are also part of the ecosystem. So some of the large accrediting bodies for higher education publish information in CTDL as well about these are the institutions that we've accredited. So there is, if you think about the providers of the credentials and the accreditors and the vendors all playing, and employers who can signal what are the skills that they're looking for, all of that in CTDL allows for the integration of that information into a navigable,
That makes sense.
And
Can I take a practical example, Scott? Sorry for interrupting you. What is your relationship with CHIA, for example, the Council on Higher Education and Accreditation? Do you work with them? Are you familiar with them in the US?
We are, Deb. I know you've been doing a lot of work with those kind of QA bodies, including in Kwahe. Do you want to just take a second on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the key value proposition for quality assurance bodies is that the information about what they're trying to do quality assurance on is often coming to them in disconnected, not very well organized structures. So they benefit in doing their work if the data they're getting is in CTDL. But it's also important for them to clearly identify what they have QA'd, right? So for example, there's confusion because sometimes the quality assurance is at the institution level or the program level or even at the individual course level. And it's important to the QA entities to be able to be clear about that. Sure. So the CTDL enables a QA entity to attach data in CTDL about that quality assurance to this specific entity in the registry, be it an organization, a program, or a course.
That makes sense. So those of you that are on the call that are not familiar with this territory, we can send you a list of acronyms afterwards, okay?
Yeah.
Just bear with us a little bit. I've tried to put a hold on some of them, but if you're feeling you're a little bit lost, just talk to one of us on the Pset Cloud team. I can hear. I thought it's only South Africans that use acronyms, but I see you do your part as well in the US.
Sorry about that. And just to
yeah.
answer your question, we do work with CHIA, the largest. So for those of you who don't know, CHIA is the body of all of the accrediting, the higher education accrediting bodies in the United States. So a number of regional as well as national accreditors. And in fact, James, my current board chair is the president of the largest accreditor in the country. And so we do work with accrediting bodies quite a bit. We also work with, and I wanted to take this just back to the retail association conversation. The National Federation of Retailers in the United States is also a partner who publishes both their credentials, but also is publishing information about the pathways through retail that people can see in a digital format. So we've been working with Retail Federation, Restaurant Association, Hotel and Lodging, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and others to make sure that the employer voice, both in terms of what they offer as an association, but what they need, is also available to be described in CTDL.
Okay. Look, thank you for giving us your time today. It's good we're working closer together. We've been hearing about Credential Engine for a long time, but all of a sudden I'm feeling like we're closer. We're just talking more, and it's a good place to be. So I was wondering if I can put Tumelo on the spot a little bit. Tumelo, if you are with us, could you just in 3 lines tell everybody what we're trying to do with the Pset cloud? I used to be a teacher, so I've got this bad habit of putting people on the spot. And if you,
wow, you're really putting me on the spot.
Just put in your own words, eh?
Yeah. So what we're trying to achieve with the Pset cloud is bringing together a fragmented system into one platform. And when I mean fragmented, I don't mean that it's not working. It's working, but in silos. So trying to bring all of that into one conversation and one platform that enables the conversations between those entities to be taken forward very easily. And the communication between those entities allows for opportunities both in supply and demand to be identified. Biggest challenge is that when these two sides are not talking to each other, we often don't get things right. But the moment that data flows between these two sides, the likelihood of getting things right in terms of policy, in terms of practical implementation, and also identifying opportunities for citizens.
Pretty good. That's pretty good, Tumelo. It's pretty good.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. So Francois, if you are with us, so we've just asked Francois and team to do some work for us. And Francois, if you're comfortable, just in a couple of lines, just to tell us what are you busy with, if you're okay to do that.
Hi, James, thanks. Very quickly, I've got another meeting to go to. We basically putting together a foundational taxonomy, which is, in a nutshell, trying to bring together the supply and the demand together into this taxonomy, and then that gets put into the, we heard it already, the minimum viable product. So we kind of trying to bring that all together and look at all these different taxonomies from the skills side, the occupation side, you mentioned ONET, and see what we can do in getting these together and maximizing the amount of information that can be used to make that sort of system usable, I suppose, and useful. Yeah, but small parts, that's what I'm learning. Very small
part. It's an important part. Francois based at the University of Cape Town, Scott and Deb, and so they just, this is a gap that we've had, and that's why I want Francois and team to know about CTDL, and perhaps we can also do an offline thing at some point if they want to talk a bit more to you, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I'll just mention, if it's beneficial, after we held our initial CTDL advisory group meeting, a number of people from around the world asked for a deep dive on CTDL. And we are just in the process of scheduling that. It'll be early morning our time, so about the same time for you. We'll make sure that everyone on this call gets that information, and anyone is welcome to join.
Thanks, Scott. I think that's great. Okay, guys, parting shot. Deb, your last comments or anything you would want to say, and then I'll give Scott a chance and then we'll close. So Deb, you go first.
Well, I think you framed me as being the tech on the call, but really we do this because it helps people connect with opportunities and understand the difference between different opportunities. So that's the bottom line for us.
And you're doing a good job from where we sit. So we're really looking at you as a great example. But what's important for us is we don't want to copy and paste. You know, as much as these things are open, you know, we have our own journey and we want to learn from you. But I'm sure there's some things that we're doing that will be good for you as well. Scott.
Yeah, so I was amazed. Simpiwe, thank you so much for organizing this and for sharing a lot of information about the Pset Cloud's work ahead of time. As I was reading through some of those documentations, it just struck me how it sounded like things that we've been writing for the United States, and for our work in trying to position the need for open data, for interoperability, for better alignment of systems to serve people. So that just tells me that there is, I think, a lot that we can be doing together to benefit each other, to learn from each other. And as you said early on, James, it's wonderful to be able to spend time with people who understand all of this and are moving in the same direction. So very exciting to be with you today and really appreciate everyone's time to join us.
So let's close on that note. Thank you again for your time, and thanks for my colleagues as well. Budget speech, if you haven't been watching it, you're probably going to do that very quickly now, but I think this was much more interesting. So thanks everybody for your time, and we're going to close now. Thanks, Scott and Deb, and thanks for Simpiwe for setting this up.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.